ASUS ROG Crosshair X670E Extreme. Motherboard overview by request. This is going to be about slots and storage PCI Express resource allocations. And we're going to be looking at and comparing the difference in design versus implementation. Yes, we have some shared resources. Yes, we have 3 slots. And yes, we have 5 M.2 drives. But there's going to be some give and take in all that resource allocation. So we're going to go through and itemize and look at what we have in the CPU and see what we have in the chipset. We're also going to take a look at the I/O panel and see how that sorts out, because of the 3 things we're looking for with the documentation of the motherboard manual and with the motherboard BIOS manual. We do not have, what's the number one thing we need? We need that block diagram. So let's hope ASUS will get back to doing that. But we will have the specifications, and we will have the motherboard layout. So working with the motherboard layout, we're going to start with the contents, and then once we get into the specifications, then we'll go through that and itemize. Because as we look at all this information we need to gather, we have to look at the motherboard, CPU, and chipset. And as we go through that and sort all those resources out and see how those chipsets work out, we're going to have 3 numbers we're going to have given to us. 2 are from AMD, 1 is our total. And I want to thank you guys and appreciate the questions. If you'll have a comment or a question we don't cover, please leave a comment in the video. We'll do our best, and if it's something we can answer quickly, we will. But if it's something like this that requires a video, then so be it. Because we're all about answering subscriber questions. Now, establish the first thing. On the benchmark, we're with a 16-core CPU with 28 lanes. And we're going to reference that to the machine in front of us, which is a high-end desktop, which would be in the middle, and above that's a workstation. So as we talk about a 16-core CPU with 28 lanes and reference that to a CPU that could have more cores or the same, but has a higher lane count, such as 128 lanes, all that matters. Now, a focus of 3 things we're going to look at here. We're going to do our add-in card scenarios. Instead of having 3 add-in cards, we're going to do 4. Will this take a quad card? Yes, it can. It can be bifurcated. There's 3 primary things we're looking at in the BIOS. 1 about bifurcation. Number 2, what about a GPU? Yes, that can be an alternate, and you'll understand once we get into the CPU and itemize what's in that CPU, what's available on that CPU, what we can do with the CPU, and how that relates to the I/O panel, because there's going to be 4 USB-C connectors on there that we're interested in referencing. 10 gigabit, 40 gigabit, 2 of those connectors because the USB 4, that's the Intel chipset for Thunderbolt 4, aka now USB 4, but it's USB 4 version 1. And then that other USB-C connector is a 20 gigabit USB-C. So we're going to sort that out and see what's going to the CPU, what's going to the chipset, and it's going to matter how it relates to the CPU, to reiterate, what's in the CPU, what we can do on the CPU, and how video comes out of that motherboard. Because, well, you'll see once we get to the I/O panel. Let's go to the motherboard. And to reiterate, the ASUS ROG Crosshair X670E Extreme. We're going straight to the tech specs, and there's information we're looking for we want congruent information. We're going to take a look at the CPU, we're going to take a look at information on the chipset, we're going to reference information on the memory, and one of the big questions, and I can't zoom in on it from here, but I will when I get to the manual because this will jump. We're going to get into this issue about DDR5, ECC versus Non ECC. And as to reiterate, we mentioned about USB 4, that matters on graphics, because if you'll notice that says 2 USB 4 ports that support USB-C display output. That, folks, is coming out of the CPU because there's onboard GPU graphics, 2 GPU cores. And of course, the heart of what we do, the slots and storage, 2 PCI Express 5.0 slots, shared resources, a 3rd slot, which is on the chipset, and all that matters in how those M.2 connectors, because to reiterate, on storage, we have 5 M.2 connectors. However, 4 of those are through the CPU. And when we start counting resources, that gets a little bit weird. And 6 SATA ports. We'll go through all that. Ethernet, Intel 2.5 gigabit, Marvell 10 gigabit Ethernet. So we're going to count resources as we account for lanes. Any resource that requires multiples of lanes, such as, to reiterate, the Marvell 10 gigabit Ethernet and the 20 gigabit USB-C. Bluetooth, that also takes a PCI Express lane. Oh, and to reiterate, each one of those SATA ports is a PCI Express lane if they're on one of the primary or secondary chipsets. If it's a separate chipset, could be different. Now, when we look at USB-C, one of those ports that's to the front, I believe, is going to be 60 watts. We'll look at that on the motherboard as we get to the layout. So we have 2 USB-C ports that are 20 gigabit, one to the front and, to reiterate, one to the rear. Audio, we'll address that as we look at this according to a DAW, because this would also make a good digital audio workstation. But I mention this now because you'll probably want to use a separate digital audio interface. And as it relates to the USB-C ports, for anybody wanting to add one of those VR headsets, we'll talk about that as it relates to latency, whether out of the CPU, through the primary chipset or the secondary chipset, as well as the bandwidth through whichever port you're going to use. Back I/O panel, we're going to look at that once we get to the manual. And internal connectors, nice to know there's plenty of headers here for fans. And then we have that extra 6-pin power tap, which will get us power to that front USB-C port. While we're here, before we go to the manual, let's take a look at support right quick. A couple things we're going to look at here under CPU and memory that we're going to reference and come back to. The 4 CPUs we're going to be looking at, we're going to be working on the Ryzen 7950 because, to reiterate, that's 16 cores, 32 threads. And while we're at it, I'm going to mention this right now on memory. If you'll notice, under memory, where we can specify type, one kind of memory we're going to be using is a UDIMM. So this is DDR5 UDIMM. Socket support 1 or 2, that's all they've tested. RAM speed, you've got options. Size or capacity, and the vendors. However, what you do not find, and we have only one CPU, the Ryzen 7000, is anything there on RAM that references DDR5 ECC versus Non ECC. So we're going to make some clarifications on that, and we're going to have a separate video to parse a lot of this information out because I'm going to try to keep this tight to keep it brief. But the DDR5, let's go look at the CPU, and that'll bring that first into focus. Because to support DDR5 ECC, there's really 4 requirements. One's the CPU. Let's go to that. The AMD Ryzen 7950. We're going to scroll down to specifications, and we've got to have all specifications to get the information we need. And there's going to be a point or two here. We're going to look for some clarification. First of all, 16 CPU cores, supported chipsets. We're on the X670E. And to reiterate, the X670E is PCI Express 5. And the X670E is actually 2 chips. 2 of those make one of those. So we have a CPU, PCI Express 5, then we have 2 chipsets that are PCI Express 4 and below. And those 2 chipsets, we're going to have usable lanes of 8 and 12. CPU, we're going to have usable lanes of 24, 28 total. And the total count that we get beyond that, which we call absolute total of 32. But that's by my count, so consider the source. But it's interesting, without a block diagram, trying to go through all those lanes and evaluate, it's easy to add up the usable lanes, but the total lanes, that's a whole nother thing. So we don't mind getting in the weeds, but we're going to try to avoid the rabbit holes. I don't mind going down rabbit holes, but sometimes it's a conundrum, up for conjecture. So let's stay on our path. Now remember, we're talking CPU, so this is CPU support for USB-C, yes, shows the amount of ports it's got, speeds and all that, not relevant. Right here what we want. Now this is native PCI Express lanes. These are PCI Express 5. So we have 28 total and 24 usable because it's the CPU we're looking at. And the CPU supports RAID, RAID 0, RAID 1, and RAID 1.0. To reiterate, memory is DDR5. 128 gigs were dual channel. These are UDIMMs. And it also identifies the speeds. And yes, there are those that overclock speeds. What's important is UDIMMs. And even more important here is ECC support. Yes, requires motherboard support. Now I want to interject on this because all this is absolutely fascinating. This whole thing with DDR5 as it's unfolding is a whole new animal, and the DDR5 is absolutely the future. However, that tells us, and we're going to do another video later about the DDR5 to reiterate that will give information that AMD says this and Intel says that. So you have to consider the source, and I'm telling you what we know and what we have found and what we're sharing with you. Now, the only identification we get from AMD is about the CPU, to reiterate, supports ECC. Okay, there's 2 types. There's On-die ECC, that's Non ECC. And then there's Sideband. If you want ECC memory, it's got to have both of those. If you've only got one, which is the On-die, that's Non ECC. I know that's confusing. Because as the memory goes faster, ECC is going to be necessary. Does all DDR5 have On-die ECC? It's supposed to. But I can show you some memories that I'm not, that do not reference whether it has that or not. And a lot of times when you're looking for information about ECC, you'll get a lot of obfuscation and a lot of this and that. So I think everyone that's going to be reporting about this stuff needs to tell the specificity and the full line. Because when we get through looking at the CPU with all these pieces of information we're looking at, one thing we're going to be missing from the chipset, which I take this considering what AMD is telling us when they say motherboard support, 2 requirements. The chipset has to support it, but the BIOS has to support it. So there's a division there on whether the chipset supports it or not. AMD needs to define that, because if the chipset doesn't support it, there's no way the BIOS is going to support it. What's the setting you're looking for? When we get to DDR, we're going to look at all that. If you see something about RAS or DDR ECC, that's talking about on-die. Anything in the BIOS that deals with parity is when you're talking about ECC memory. If there's nothing in there about parity, then there's no ECC. Now, questionable whether or not the chipset supports it, I don't know. And the reason I say that is because they're talking about motherboard support. We'll look at the information again to reiterate what ASUS has on this motherboard, and what you see on the website may be different than what you see in the document, specifically the manual. But as the terminology, you have to decipher and read through some of that. There needs to be some clarity. And some of these terminologies we're talking about is going to be in a separate video. But I want to tell you enough that what you need to know, that right now, if we took 4 manufacturers and we looked at, say, Kingston, Crucial, maybe ADATA, pick another one. 4 manufacturers, we're going to see 2 types of DDR5. On-die ECC, which is Non ECC, and Sideband. Those 2 are different. When you talk about on-die ECC, you're talking consumer memory. When you're talking about DDR5 ECC, sideband, then you're talking about a workstation. And we have another video we're going to do about a workstation that uses DDR5, and we'll use DDR5 ECC sideband so you can see the difference. It's on an Intel chipset. Now, if we look at the Intel documentation, CPU supports it, chipset has to support it, motherboard BIOS has to support it, and the memory has to support it. So those 4 components. What we get with this, to reiterate, on-die ECC is Non ECC. Consumer memory. That's just the way it is. And I've been through all this, and I've got a lot of stuff I want to share with you, but for a separate video, I'm going to give you enough in the documentation for the description so that you can reference some of this information. One of the best sources is Crucial. Passmark MemTest also has some excellent information. And there's another company that makes the data analyzers for DDR5 that has probably some of the best information as it relates to the JEDEC spec, talking about I3C being backwards compatible with I2C, which is on the SM bus, but with sideband, the sideband bus is supposed to be backwards compatible, so that tells us the tracers are there, but it just has to be enabled, which means we should be able to have chipset support, which means all we need is BIOS support. If that's true, we don't know. But this is what we've got from AMD, CPU support. To reiterate, we will not see that on the chipset as we go look at it. AMD needs to do 2 things. 1, clarify, and 2, identify. If they would do that, that would simplify this. Because who benefits the most from DDR5 ECC? Absolutely everyone. You want to overclock? You want to use ECC. You want a workstation? You want ECC. You want a stable machine? You want ECC. But right now, you've got consumer memory, and then you've got your industrial, enterprise, workstation memory. They're 2 different classes. But AMD's got, well, the first part of the support. Intel has all 3, or actually 4. But I'm going to say that for another video. Let's get back to the specs because we got more stuff to cover. I hope you guys are excited about this stuff like we are, because it's absolutely fascinating. There's no better time to be building a computer than right now. And this is what we're at. And this is one technology we expect to accelerate up until we get to PCI Express 6 with 2 technologies. There's a new spec for NVMe, which is going to blow the doors off what we're doing now, and also CXL, which will change the way we reallocate resources. Going to blow all this away. It's going to start on the enterprise and trickle down. As we always talk about, the consumer desktop, high-end desktop, and the workstation, and bifurcation is trickled down from the server. I think DDR5 is going to go up and trickle down before we move on to number 6. PCI Express 6 is going to blow all this out of the water, but probably a couple of years away from the date of this video. But this right now is fascinating, so let's get back to our stats on the CPU. From ECC to graphics capability. Yes, sir, we have graphics capability within the CPU, and some people seem to get lost on this point, and I don't understand why, so let's reiterate this and let's think about this. We have a 16-core CPU, and we have 2 GPU cores that are on that CPU. And when we get back to talking about the rear I/O panel, and we're starting to look at how that's going to work, this is going to matter because we're going to see how that plays out. So to reiterate, one of the options for an add-in card scenario is a video card, a GPU, because you have on board. Now, because we talk about content creation and rendering, and it's all about slots and storage, that blows all that out of the water because you want a GPU if you're going to render. If all you want to do is see what you're doing and you're editing, you can use the onboard. So if it's about getting on the platform and then you can upgrade, that's an option. More. And the more being the other important feature that we want to point out is the USB-C DisplayPort alternate mode. It was around, it went away, it came back with a passion, and now that support is on the CPU, so that's how we get video out of that onboard GPU. And supports the AMD Expo technology. Now for the motherboard manual, let's go from memory, manuals and documents. There's two manuals here, and I'm going to show you this partly because I want to show you the date. Right down here we have a BIOS manual. At the time of this video, it's been out around 15 days. That's what we were waiting for. And the regular manual, this said we've had it about a month. It was up there, it disappeared, and it came back. So in this manual, the first thing we're going to do is go to Contents, which will be on page 3. We're going to look at the specifications, connectors with shared bandwidth. I want to stop at package contents while we're at it for 2 points. Number 1, when you get your product, whatever it is, put a camera on it. So when you do your unboxing, you can check and make sure what you've ordered is what you've received. Separate video, big deal. Number 2, inventory your parts. Even though you can't use everything, there might be something that might not be in that box that would prevent you from using what you're trying to do. So be sure and make those 2 points known. We got to be adamant about that. Because if you're missing a part, RMA the motherboard, because they don't sell parts, they sell motherboards. And if you're missing something, that's what they're going to tell you to do. And you got that 30-day window. So you want to maintain the stability of the system so you can test everything within that window. 2 talking points. Let's go back to the specs on the contents. Motherboard layout. I like to start with the motherboard layout because I think that's very telling about who is where and what. Okay, to reiterate, we have 2 slots. PCI Express plus 16_1, PCI Express plus 16_2. And if you'll notice, right here it looks like 1, 2 M.2 drives. How do we get 5? Okay, that's 2. Right here is 3 and 4. Where's number 5? Well, we'll get to it. And also that 3rd slot. So we have the primary and the secondary slot to the CPU. And this 3rd slot, which is PCI Express before, that's through the chipset. Over here on the right, we have 2 USB 2 headers. And the most important header we want to look at, right there, that's for, I believe it's our USB-C 20 gigabit. And that should be the power tap, which is out at a right angle to put 60 watts of power out that port out the front. And over here on the left, we're going to take another look at this from the other direction when we look at the I/O panel. Anyway, to reiterate, we're looking at our USB over here, right there. USB 4 EC1 and USB 4 EC2. Now let's go look at the specification summary. We started with the CPU. We've got to look at the chipset. Let's go take a gander. Now, the information AMD gives us is the AMD socket AM5 chipset. All these details matter. We'll look at the chipsets, and to reiterate, we're focused on the top of the line X670E specifications. Some of this gets, I think, a little bit confusing, but we're going to need to go through this. Okay, as we're looking at slots and storage, graphics, and the NVMe, that says 1 16-lane slot or 2 8-lane slots, which is what we see on the motherboard. That's a 16-lane slot by itself. However, when primary slot _1 and secondary slot _2 are used simultaneously, we only have so many lanes to go around. We have how many lanes? 24 usable lanes. So let's count those out. Those 2 slots have to have 16 lanes between them because it's a shared resource. That's what you've got on a consumer desktop motherboard. If you need more resources, you've got to go to a high-end desktop or you've got to go to a workstation. And a workstation we think is the best bang for the buck if you need those kind of resources. So we've got 16 lanes between 2 slots. And we've got 3 slots on the motherboard, that other's through the chipset. So we got 16 lanes on 2 slots. That leaves us with 4 lanes for an M.2, which is 20, and another M.2, which is 24. So how do we get 4 M.2 drives to work with all those slots? Glad you asked that question. Let's take a look. But first, let's finish looking at the specs. Everything is always about a confirmation of a congruent information. Now, this shows the 1 16-lane slot, which could be for whatever, or 2 8-lane slots, but there's only 16 lanes there to reiterate to work with. Then we have 1 M.2 NVMe, which is PCI Express 5, and that would be this slot, M.2_1, because another question we oftentimes get asked is, well, what about with the GPU in that primary slot and then that primary M.2_1. Will that work fine? Yes, that'll work fine just like it is. I've been amazed and surprised how many times we've been asked that question. Now what we're looking at is M.2_1, and then we have M.2_2 over here. And the allocation of these lanes, we can account for that one slot or two slots, and we can account for that primary M.2, plus the 4 PCI Express GPP, which was general purpose processor lanes. That accounts for the second one. Or to reiterate, M.2_2. And that can be, either one of these can be 2280 all the way down to 2242. Same here, 2280 all the way down to 2242. So again, how do we account for these? Okay, we've got to read some fine print. Now one last item we're going to look at here, because it's the only last item we have, usable PCI Express lanes. This is one feature I don't care for. They've lumped all the lanes together. 44 total lanes and 24 PCI Express 5 usable lanes. Personally, I think that's confusing because we have, to reiterate, on the CPU, 28 total lanes, we get 32. Usable lanes, 24, we've gone through the count. But to lump all those 44 lanes, which are one CPU and 2 chipsets, PCI Express 5 needs to be kept separate from PCI Express 4. And PCI Express 4 resources are what's through the chipset. Primary chipset, secondary chipset, 8 lanes, 12 lanes, usable. Those are pretty easy to account for. Usually an M.2 drive could be 10 gigabit Ethernet, that right there. That could be 8 lanes, that could be 6 lanes. It depends on how they're allocated. And if there's a 20 gigabit USB-C port, wired on the motherboard, it's going to be 2 lanes. If it's on an add-in card, it could be 4 lanes. Depends on the resource, depends on how the chipset is designed. I can show you information from Marvell that says that uses 4 lanes. But if you try to do the lane count and you figure out where 4 lanes are at, it gets confusing. We need a block diagram that shows allocation of lanes. We don't have it. But what is relevant and matters most for everybody to understand is how the slots work out and how the M.2 NVMe connectors work out, and then where you go with your resources on the I/O panel. CPU, some chipset, which would be primary chipset. Secondary chipset gets everything else, which would be lower priority, like SATA ports, probably one of the M.2 connectors. So you can put 4 SATA ports and one M.2, that's 8. And it's easy to come up with another 2 and another 2 to get to 12. And it's easy to hit 8 when you count 4 and 4, or you're counting 4, 2, and 2. It's easy to hit that number. So now that we've established this, the one thing, the glaring thing we don't have, remember referencing RAM, there's nothing here on the chipset that says anything about DDR support. DDR5, but not just DDR5, but DDR5 ECC. There's nothing there. Now, according to AMD, it looks like those 4 requirements. You got to have the CPU, which we have. You have to have RAM. Okay, there is no RAM that we have seen as of this date that is qualified to work on this motherboard that is ECC. It's all non-ECC. And we can show you book and verse with information, which we will in a separate video when we talk about DDR5, how all this works and how it plays out. Because to reiterate, let's look back at the manual first, and you'll see we'll have that as we talk. So that covers everything we need on the chipset. Okay, back to the manual. In the specification summary, right here, and this I think is what trips a lot of people up. Up here at the top, ECC and non-ECC. And then there's a star, and these are unbuffered, so that's UDIMMs. And here's the star. Non-ECC unbuffered DDR5 memory supports On-die ECC function. Yet up here it says ECC and non-ECC. And what we're going to be looking for when we get to the motherboard BIOS manual, we'll be looking for bifurcation. It exists. It can be done when we go through the add-in card scenarios. But the issue about RAM, that's a bit of a conundrum, but based on the information that's given, everything that's in the BIOS, it relates to non-ECC. Even the function that talks about DDR ECC, that's for non-ECC memory because it's got on-die. And the only support in the BIOS is for on-die. There's a lot of this going on. To reiterate, you want sideband. And the issue with sideband, because it's working more, you're going to have maybe a 1 to 2% performance decrease. Memory's going to cost maybe 10 to 20% more. But as we go faster and as we go denser with DDR5, you've got to have that ECC for error correction. It's not just, as it says, on-die within the memory. And according to information we have from Crucial, if you can divide the number of chips, you want to look at it physically, by 3 or 5, then one of those chips is going to be the chip that deals with that. 3 things that have come about because of DDR5 ECC. First of all, for On-die, the SPD, the Serial Presence Detect chip, is not just a chip, it's a hub. Number 2 is the Power Management Integrated Circuit. And the number 3 is the On-die ECC feature. So On-die means it does error correction within the memory. But when you need the memory to talk to the memory controller, and where's the memory controller? It's in the CPU. So for that, you need sideband. We don't have it because we have nothing in the BIOS about parity. I get excited sharing this stuff because I think it's fascinating. But it's coming online. We're going to see it. And to reiterate, Intel has it working on a platform with a chipset, with a motherboard that we're going to talk about in a separate video when we talk about workstation build specs, because again, another subscriber asked a question, what would you recommend for the build specs for a business workstation? So a business workstation is a little bit different than content creation, which is what we're always dealing with. Because right now, if we recommend a regular workstation, we're talking about a WRX80, and that would be with DDR4. However, when we start talking about a business workstation that needs DDR ECC capability, now we're talking DDR5. Completely different animal, something we've never talked about. I'm exceedingly excited to share it with you, but I don't want to spill the beans now other than stay tuned for it. Back to memory. And we'll check this information again when we get back into the BIOS manual. Okay, right down here. Now remember we talked about the CPU supporting DisplayPort alternate mode. And right here it talks about graphics. 2 USB 4 ports support USB-C display outputs. Now this says VGA resolution support depends on processor or graphics card resolution. That's a kind of a blanket generic statement because this USB 4 USB-C port, of which there are 2, that information is coming. Well, keep that in mind. We'll look at it when we get to the I/O panel. But that's coming out of the CPU, out of those 2 GPU cores. That's not coming out of a separate video card. Okay, and to reiterate, 2 PCI Express 5.0 with 16 slots by 16 electrically and mechanically on the first slot, and the second slot, even though it's by 16 mechanically, it's only by 8 electrically. And when both slots are used simultaneously, and we got an asterisk here because this is a biggie, they're going to both be by 8. However, and hold on to that however, and the third slot is PCI Express by 4, dedicated slot through the chipset. Okay, what gets weird is as we account for 5 M.2 drives and what happens with these slots. Okay, first asterisk. When the PCI Express 5.0 M.2 card is installed on the PCI Express bus 16_2 slot, PCI Express bus 16_1 will only run at by 8. Okay, that we know to be true. Now, when M.2_2 is enabled, PCI Express bus 16_1 will run by 8, and PCI Express bus 16_2 will run by 4. Wow. So you get how that works. Not kind of what we expected, but it is what it is. So can we put a quad card in here? Yeah, you can. Can we bifurcate the slot? Yes, we can for 4 drives. And bifurcation is 4x4x4x4 because you have to have 4 lanes for each M.2 drive, hence a 16-lane slot. And yes, you can fully bifurcate it. And yes, you can bifurcate the second slot. But, you know, it's like you do this, you got to give and take. So if you want to go with the default of 5 M.2 drives, I wouldn't try to put a quad card on here because it ain't going to work. Can you put a dual adapter on here? Yes, you can. Because of the resource allocations, you could get away with it on the first slot because it's got full bifurcation. So a dual adapter like the Supermicro Dual M.2 NVMe adapter would probably be the more ideal situation. What about a video card? Well, that's an interesting position. If you put a dual adapter in there, it would have to be in the primary slot, and your video card would have to be in the second slot, but then you couldn't run that second M.2 NVMe drive on the motherboard. So again, to reiterate the question, will it be okay if I have just the video card and just the primary M.2 drive? Yes, that's fine. That works. I've seen that question more than once. So that clarity, I hope that helps. The problem comes in when you start trying to add all this stuff in because we've only got 24 lanes to work with. So if you allocate 24 lanes and here you got 16, now all of a sudden you've got 8 and 8, because the allocation of the resources for the other devices, how does all that play out? And remember, we've got that other M.2 connector up on the board by the memory, which is a dual adapter. You got PCI Express 5 on one side and PCI Express 4 on the other side. So that's where that other drive's at. We'll look at it in a minute. But how these resources are allocated, you're good to go with the primary M.2 PCI Express 5. PCI Express 5 to the CPU. It's that second M.2 NVMe drive where resources become a problem. And I'm going to read this again, because you got to let this soak in. When the PCI Express 5.0 M.2 card is installed on the PCI Express bus 16_2 slot, PCI Express bus 16_1 will only run by 8. So that leaves out a quad card, and that leaves out a dual adapter if you're working with what's in the box. Can you put a video card in there? Yes, you can. PCI Express with 16_1 will be an 8-lane slot. However, when the M.2 is enabled, that's on the motherboard, PCI Express bus 16, which runs it by 8, yep, but then PCI Express bus 16_2 runs it by 4. Wow, okay. Well, if I've got a card in there that's PCI Express 5.0 and it is a single card adapter, I would look at that as passive cooling, which is brilliant. We've seen for, of all the M.2 drives and heat sinks we've tested, it looks like passive cooling is better than active cooling. And then, of course, with active cooling, you've got, is it blowing with a fan, which is what we tested, but then there's also liquid cooling. I'm on the fence about that. We talked about in the last video, I'll put a link up for a company that has a closed solution for the primary video card and for the primary M.2 to be liquid cooled if you want to go that route. But this is passive cooling. So if you work with it as is out of the box to get those 5 drives, it will work. Remember, 4 of them are on the CPU. So you got the primary number 1, you got the secondary number 2, but because of that, if you put that card in there, which would be number 3, that's a 4-lane slot. Wow, 4 lanes are all you need for that drive, so that'll work. And then the other one's on the other side of that dual card, that's PCI Express 5 on one side and PCI Express 4 on the other, that's up there by the memory. We'll get to it. Okay, so we've addressed add-in cards. A quad card, a dual adapter. What about the video card? That's interesting. We're not finished with that yet. And then the other option, what about a capture card? Okay, because of resources as allocated, if you do as it ships, then that puts that capture card in that 3rd slot. 4 lanes through the chipset, you'll be fine. Because those that want to do a 4K 60 capture card, the consumer variety, that'll work. Elgato and Evermedia, both those cards. Personally, as I've mentioned before, I prefer the external solutions. There's 2 from Blackmagic. One is Thunderbolt based. The other one is strictly USB-C. I'll put links up. I don't want to get into them here, separate video. But I think those are better options for capture devices. And they also present themselves to the system as a webcam. But I don't want to get into it, separate video. So if you use this as is, identifying the add-in cards we've gone through, there's information we need to look at as it relates to the I/O panel, which would probably be a good time right now to look at how those ports are allocated. Remember what we've learned about the CPU. Remember what we've learned about the chipset and what we didn't find about the chipset. But we need to see how those 4 USB-C connectors are allocated on that I/O panel. I think now's a good time. Let's look down here at the rear I/O connections. And I like to go from top down, left to right. But in this case, the only thing we need to concern ourselves with is the, since it's on the top, number 3 and 4. One of these is going to be the 10 gigabit. And number 3 is 10 gigabit, which is on the left right here. And number 4 is a 2.5 gigabit. So that's your Marvell. Now, right here across the bottom are our 4 USB-C ports. Number 7, number 9, 11, and 12. Number 7, that's a USB-C port, 10 gigabit. Number 9 is USB 4 EC1. Number 11, USB 4 EC2. And then number 12 is the 2x2 port. Now, what we know to be true about the CPU, since the CPU has DisplayPort alternate mode built in and has 2 GPU cores built in to that CPU, 16-core CPU plus 2 GPU cores. And what we know to be true is USB-C comes out of the CPU. How do you think that comes out of the motherboard? One connection we didn't notice, I'm going to point out right now. We'll go back to this, and then I'm going to come back. You notice on this I/O panel, there's nothing here that's indicative of a HDMI DisplayPort in or DisplayPort out. All we have are these 4 USB-C ports. Number 7, 10 gigabit. Number 9 and number 11, which are USB 4, which is Thunderbolt 4 USB 4, Intel. And then number 12, which is 20 gigabit. So if we're looking at PCI Express 3.0 with 4 lanes dedicated for those 2 ports, those 2 USB-C ports, for 2 reasons, have to be coming from PCI Express 5 lanes, even though they're only PCI Express 3, but for 2 reasons have to be coming out of CPU lanes. Number 1, DisplayPort alternate mode, which is coming out of the CPU because of the 2-core GPU. But number 2, because there is no HDMI out and there is no DisplayPort in or out, therefore, those 2 ports are where video comes out. Therefore, those 2 ports have to be on CPU lanes to get that out. It is what it is. Now, if that's true, that would allocate the other 4 lanes, which would make the 28 lanes for the CPU, which would mean, consider the source, understand my reasoning, for why I say what I do. That would mean, therefore, that the 10 gigabit port on the left and the 20 gigabit port on the right, other ports would be allocated out of that primary chipset. Other stuff would be allocated through the secondary chipset. Now, because there's only one M.2 drive on the chipset, is it through the primary chipset or is it through the secondary chipset? We don't know. Doesn't matter. You can test and verify and see, because your lowest latency is going to be on the CPU. Then you have your two chipsets. Latency, more latency down here. So you can put the M.2 drive on a test, check it, verify it. All you'll be able to determine, since there's only one on the chipset, is that it is on a chipset based on it's going to be PCI Express 4. Because all your 4 M.2 NVMe drives that are on the CPU are PCI Express 5. So testing any one of those should all be equal in speed, equal in latency. So for content creation and rendering, I think this would be an excellent platform. If you're going to do video rendering, or if you're going to do, especially if you're going to do video rendering, a video card on this machine. If you're only going to use this for a DAW, you don't need a video card because you need fast CPU cores. And right now, at this time, DAW audio rendering is on the CPU. But that's going to change in the future because there's some applications in the works, if you've heard about. They're going to be doing a lot of what they do on GPU rendering, so that scene's going to change. So you can build this machine and get it up and running, and you'll get video out of those USB-C ports, which are coming out of the Thunderbolt ports. So that'll give you 2 displays out, but you will not have 3 displays out as some motherboards have, because there's no HDMI. Now, because there's no DisplayPort out, that means there's no DisplayPort coming out of those 2 GPU cores that are on the CPU core. To reiterate, it's all coming out of Thunderbolt. And because there's no DisplayPort going in, there's no way to put a separate video card in and ingest video into USB 4 Thunderbolt to get that onboard video turned off to use the external video card, because there's no way to route it to get it back out. So it is what it is. I'm just the messenger. So we know what we have with CPU lanes. We know what we're set up with on the I/O panel in terms of chipset lanes. What else have we got? We need to go into the BIOS manual and take a look at those other 3 things. Some have asked about PBO, and PBO is in the BIOS. Let's go look. And just a quick search of PBO will take you, and that's Precision Boost Overdrive. It's there. But from my standpoint for slots and storage, we can make this real simple now. And I appreciate ASUS finally clarifying bifurcation. And we can see the slot configuration based on the picture in the manual. PCI Express was 16_1 and PCI Express was 16_2. Depending on how you allocate the resources according to the M.2 drives, you will be able to bifurcate those slots. And the instructions here for that are auto mode and PCI Express RAID mode if you add a quad card. But a quad card would be 4 drives. A dual adapter like the Supermicro would be 2 drives. But when you do that, you have to think about the give and take of the resources, because remember, you got 4 to the CPU M.2 drives. You got a 5th one through the chipset. So I wouldn't worry about bifurcation on this. The next thing, let's go take a look at that issue with DDR. And just a quick search for DDR ECC. You'll notice that's under DDR RAS. All these acronyms. Now this DDR ECC, to reiterate, is about On-die ECC, which is Non ECC. I know that's confusing, but if you did a search for anything in the menu or in the manual for, say, scramble, data scramble, that too is for the Non ECC. If we did a search strictly for parity, there's nothing in here about parity. And to reiterate, since we don't have a setting for parity, that means that's On-die ECC and not DDR5 ECC. Those 2 separate technologies. The question came up, and from now on, whenever we talk about DDR5, I've got to go through this, because someone said ECC, Non ECC, On-die, what's the difference? And I said, well, it's all, I won't go through it again. It is what it is. But I want to make the clarity so that way there's no confusion. What we've learned is never take anything for granted, and just because we know something doesn't mean everybody knows it, and that's what we're here about. Because something I learned a long time ago. The only dumb question is the one you don't ask. If you don't know, ask a question, leave a comment in the video, because we're here to help. Now, connectors with shared bandwidth. We've been over this, but we need to go over it again. And this will confirm what we were talking about. But this is another way of looking at it. Everyone has a different light bulb moment. And that's like why we go through these different scenarios for add-in cards. Or that's why we referenced about the primary slot with the primary M.2 connector, how that works, because those questions come up. We don't want to leave anything up for conjecture. We want to be able to answer your questions the best we can based on the information we have, based on the research we've done. Every motherboard is different, and whenever you guys ask a question about what will work with this particular motherboard, I have to go through this. I have to look at the design versus the implementation, and we have to figure out motherboard, CPU, and chipset, and then see how slots and storage allocates, because this one has got to be the wildest one yet. But it works. But this drawing is another way of looking at that for another light bulb moment. And this is in the motherboard manual. Okay, A1 and A2, and then of course A3. To reiterate, configuration, PCI Express with 16_1, 16 lane slot by itself, it's 16 lanes allocated. However, when you use both 1 and 2 slots, to reiterate, that becomes by 8 each because there's only 16 lanes to be allocated between those 2 slots. However, when you add this third in the mix, which is M.2 as it says here stated, to reiterate, configuration number 3, the primary slot is 8 lanes, the secondary slot, which is that slot right there, becomes 4 lanes, and then that M.2 connector being used, which is also using 4 lanes. It's just a matter of shared resources. When you go to a high-end desktop, dedicated resources. When you go to a workstation, you get more dedicated resources. Now, to reiterate, when we look at this business workstation, you're still going to have some issues with resources where they're going to be limited, but the feature you're going to have is ECC DDR5. Also on the motherboard with the chipset we're going to show you when we get to that video, no bifurcation. Again, it's about give and take. The WRX80 workstation that we've talked about is the best bang for the buck, but it's DDR4, PCI Express 4, 8-channel memory, but it's amazing. And we expect DDR5 is going to trickle up once this technology matures. Will we see that on the next AMD EPYC with DDR5? Who knows? That's up for conjecture, but it makes me wonder because AMD is all dedicated. They're all in on PCI Express 5 and DDR5. We'll see. So that covers that slot and lane allocations resource. Again, it's shared bandwidth. Now let's take a quick look at the Republica Gamers Gen-Z.2 installation. Now this particular card, which is a double-sided card, that card is going to sit in that slot right there. And it's double-sided. PCI Express 5 on one side, PCI Express 4 on the other. And to reiterate, it's passive cooling, and the side that has the big cooler on it, that's PCI Express 5. To reiterate, the other side, back side, the left side, or the side that's closest to the memory is PCI Express 4. So you're going to have to use the stock cooling solution. There's not going to be enough room to do anything custom on that. And there's a good idea of the layout and indication of how that all works on the front and the rear. So just follow those directions. Now, we've covered the specifications, shared bandwidth, package contents. We looked at the motherboard layout where I like to start. We've also looked at the Republica Gamers Gen-Z.2 card, and we looked at the rear I/O panel. I didn't get into the machine in front of me, which is the high-end desktop. This is the Gigabyte TRX40 Designator about dedicated resources. Didn't think it was needed and necessary because I wanted to spend more time on DDR5. Fascinating topic, fascinating subject, fascinating commentary about a lot of the information going on in the obfuscation. I've spent a lot of hours with it, and I'm eager to share with you more details. And I'll try to put up the FAQ link if there's room in the description from Crucial. As I said, to reiterate, there's 3 links I think that will be very, very helpful in helping you to understand how all that works. On-die Non ECC versus ECC sideband. 2 different things. We need them both. We're going to be seeing those, to reiterate, on another video we're going to do about a business workstation build. But again, and for those wondering, is it using a Xeon? No, it's not. It's not on a Xeon, but it is on an Intel CPU. It's the W680 chipset. I'll tell you that much. So I want to thank you guys for watching. Welcome. This is BuildOrBuy. My name's Gil Boyd. We look forward to seeing you next video. We're out.